Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Corlett, and I chair the Legislative Committee for AAA New York State, which is the 5 AAA clubs serving 2.8 million members in the state. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the state's recent approval of legalized adult use of recreational marijuana. Now New York joins 16 states and DC that have legalized recreational use. Before we get started, I'd like to point out you can submit questions in the chat box located on the right-hand side. So to get us started, I would like to introduce Anthony Spada Jr. We call him Tony. Tony is the president and CEO of AAA Western and Central New York, Upstate's largest member service organization. Tony also serves as president of the AAA Clubs of New York State, a federation of the 5 AAA clubs in the state. Tony has over 40 years of experience in senior level positions with AAA. Prior to being named president and CEO in 2012, he served as the vice president of finance and CFO. Tony has several state and national AAA affiliations. He's a current board member of the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, which funds research projects to improve safety on our roads. He's also vice chair of AAA's Public Affairs Committee, we call it the PAC, which serves to guide AAA's public policy positions throughout North America, where we serve 61 million members of the Federation. So with that, please welcome Tony Spada, and I will hand it over to you, Tony.
Great. Thank you, John. And I apologize to all for not having video at this time. But AAA New York State is very proud to participate in this extremely important town hall. It's been legalized, now what? Now with me at AAA, representing some of the clubs here is the president and CEO of AAA Northeast, John Galvin, who covers, like John said, the downstate area. And then and Andy Ionati, who is representing AAA Northway in the Binghamton region. So thank you guys for also attending. It's my pleasure to kick off today's virtual town hall regarding the recently passed legalization of recreational marijuana in New York. And AAA's position is quite simply to urge the public to inform and educate themselves on the dangers and causes of impaired driving. And events like this will go a long way in educating the public. Now, AAA's message is clear. Just like alcohol, if you've used marijuana, don't drive. And if you plan to drive, don't use marijuana. Whether you smoke, vape, take edibles, getting behind the wheel when you're under the influence poses a risk to everyone on the road. In Washington State, the share of drivers who, after a fatal crash, tested positive for active THC, marijuana's psychoactive ingredient, it doubled since the state legalized marijuana in December of 2012. And new research by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety finds that people who use both alcohol and marijuana are some of the most dangerous drivers on the road. They are significantly more likely to speed, text, intentionally run red lights, miss stop signs, and basically just drive more aggressively than those who don't. So the bottom line is, when marijuana officially gets legalized, it remains illegal to drive while under the influence of it. Impaired driving kills, and you can't drive safely if you're impaired. So I look really forward to hearing from today's esteemed speakers, Erie County District Attorney John Flynn and Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first esteemed speaker, John Flynn, who is Erie County District Attorney. Now, D.A. Flynn was born and raised in Western New York and graduated from Bowling Green State University before joining the United States Navy. He then graduated from the Naval Officer Candidate School and Navy Supply Corps School. He served during the Gulf War, and after fulfilling his naval commitment, John returned to Buffalo and graduated from the University of Buffalo Law School. He then returned to active duty and served as a Navy attorney and spent 2 years leading the Office of Legal Counsel at the United States Naval Academy. John has earned several awards, including the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal and 2 Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medals. Now, in 2016, John was elected Erie County District Attorney and then was re-elected in 2020. John is a father of 5, and DA Flynn is currently Vice President of the District Attorneys Association of New York. In addition, he's a Vice President of the National District Attorneys Association, where he also leads the Metro section representing the district attorneys of large cities. Now, we've partnered with John on many community events like this in the past, and we're proud to have him with us today. So at this time, I present to you DA John Flynn. John?
Thank you, Tony, and I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the invite for talking at these panels. You know, there is a lot to the legalization of marijuana, and there are many facets of this that have been talked about, have been analyzed, have been debated now for years and years. The New York State Legislature and Governor Cuomo, you know, just didn't decide to legalize marijuana, you know, last week. This has been going on for a number of years now, and myself, along with the District Attorneys Association of the state of New York, you know, have been very concerned about some aspects of the legislation. Now, just to tell everyone up front and to be, you know, totally fair about this, not only did the District Attorneys Association of New York, but myself included, you know, we never came out against the overall legislation of marijuana. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, the state of New York has 62 separate elected district attorneys. All 62 have various views on the subject. Many of them, you know, were against the legalization overall, but as an association, we did not come out against the legalization of marijuana. Now, again, we didn't come out in favor for it either, all right? And me personally, I didn't come out against it, nor did I come out in favor for it. My main concern and our association's main concern was the driving aspect of the legalization. That is my number one concern, like I said, along with our association. And the reason it's my number one concern is that, as you mentioned, Tony, you know, in addition to being a vice president of the state association, I am also one of the vice presidents of the National District Attorneys Association. So I have had the opportunity to travel to and speak with a number of my colleagues, district attorneys across the country, specifically those who are DAs in states where it's been legalized: California, Colorado, Washington, Vermont. I can go on and on. And when I travel to and meet with and talk with district attorneys across the country in states where the legalization has occurred, some now for the past 5 or 6 years, the number one concern by far from every district attorney and everyone who has a stake in preserving the safety of their citizenry in those states is the driving aspect. Tony, it's not even close, okay? That is by far the number one concern. Now, again, there are obviously other concerns. You know, believe it or not, and I won't really get into it here, but one of the biggest groups that are concerned about the legalization of marijuana and have complaints about it in the states that have done it are homeowners association and realtors associations, okay? Because the fact that you need moisture, condensed areas to grow marijuana in your home, this is causing a significant mold problem in rental properties across these states. So believe it or not, and I found this kind of surprising, one of the biggest complainers about legalization of marijuana our realtors and homeowners, okay, because of the grown aspect. Now, again, I'm not going to get into that here. And again, that is a secondary complaint to the driving aspect of this. And so, you know, we in New York, we knew that the driving aspect was the #1 concern from other states. And so we obviously wanted to address these concerns before the legalization. And, you know, a number of concerns that I brought up along with our association, you know, some of them were addressed, but quite frankly, the majority were not addressed. I can tell you that, you know, when it came to driving, the #1 concern that we had was in some of the draft pieces of legislation, it was going to be lowered from a misdemeanor to a violation getting caught driving while under the influence of marijuana. That would have been unacceptable. To lower that from a misdemeanor to a violation would have sent a wrong message, would have emboldened drivers, quite frankly, to feel that they could smoke and perhaps get behind the wheel. And if they would have got caught, they would have got nothing more than a speeding ticket or a cell phone ticket or a driving without a seatbelt ticket, which is what a violation would have been. So this was unacceptable. And we let our legislators in the governor's office know this was unacceptable. And to their credit, they reversed course and they kept it as a misdemeanor. So again, I will start off by giving them credit for doing that. What they didn't address and what they didn't really recognize was the difficulty in policing the roads when it comes to driving under the influence of marijuana. And I say this for a couple of reasons. First of all, everyone needs to know that New York is one of only 5 states in the country. 5. The other 45 don't have this problem. But New York is one of the few states in the country where you have to, in order to successfully prosecute a driving under the influence of being impaired while on drugs, you have to, 1, have a noted impairment of someone driving. So the law enforcement officer needs to note an actual impairment behind the wheel. That's #1. #2 is you have to identify, here in New York, we have to identify exactly what the controlled substance is. Whether it's alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, fentanyl, whatever. We have to identify specifically what the actual controlled substance is. And again, before legalization, marijuana was on a list of controlled substances in the state of New York. Marijuana has now been taken off that list. And so our concern was, if you take marijuana off that list, you're going to have to do something to allow us to enforce driving while under the influence of marijuana on our roads and highways. Now, again, to their credit, they did. While they took marijuana off the controlled substance list, they added marijuana in the vehicle and traffic laws, where they said that, you know, driving under the influence of marijuana applies to the vehicle and traffic laws and therefore can be enforced. So again, I'll give them credit for doing that, but they didn't think of another problem, which is, in order to specifically identify marijuana as the substance the impaired driver was using while on the road, law enforcement personnel need some evidence that marijuana was used. And without the smell of marijuana on the driver, without seeing perhaps marijuana in the car, there's no way to identify it was marijuana unless the driver admits it. And again, how many times is a driver going to admit they were smoking marijuana? This becomes a problem with the odorless edibles, which are going to be in common use now once the legalization occurs. If it's an odorless edible, a gummy bear, a brownie, whatever it may be, all right? If the person doesn't admit that they were using this, and the officer, even if they notice an impairment, we're still not going to be able to prove our case because I can't prove it was specifically marijuana. And that is the problem. And, you know, the legislature and the governor could have solved this, okay? They could have just made a rule and said that a drug is anything that causes an impairment or some kind of general definition like that. And therefore, I wouldn't need now to identify what the particular drug was. As long as the officer could identify a noted impairment, that would have covered me if they would have just changed the definition to a drug equals any impairment at all from any substance that causes a driver to have impairment, or again, something along those lines. But they didn't do that. And so we are going to be faced with a problem here of enforcing the marijuana laws on the highway due to the current constraints that we're under and the definitions and legalese that we're still under here in New York. You know, I see my time's almost up here. So one last thing is, you know, Albany has a tendency to write laws and then not fund them. You know, kind of like my daughter now. Okay, my daughter, she's 16 years old. She's been at home for the whole year. She's in high school, you know, doing virtual learning. You know, and you know, I'm embarrassed to say it, but you know, she's got my credit card number memorized. Okay, and you know, she, you know, instead of going to school lunches here where it costs $2 for a lunch, you know, she'll order Grubhub, okay, for lunch, all right, on my credit card. And again, you know, she's not paying for it. It's going on a card. It doesn't hit till 30 days later. She thinks it's free, okay? And so, you know, Albany's like my daughter, okay, where, you know, they pass these laws and they don't pay for them. And the bill now comes 30 days later. They didn't pay for a key thing here, okay? And it needs to be addressed. They didn't pay for drug recognition experts and the funding of DREs statewide. They made an annotation of it and a note of it in legislation for state troopers, okay? And that's great, all right? If they fund state troopers, that's phenomenal. But you got every sheriff's department in New York State. You got every city, town, village, law enforcement entity in New York State where they need to be funded too, because again, they gotta be able to recognize an impairment, and an impairment for marijuana is different, as a doctor can tell you here. I won't go into his dissertation here, but as a doctor can tell you, the characteristics and the signs that one exhibits for being high on marijuana is different than alcohol. And the officers need to be trained on this. That's expensive. They got to go away for 4 or 5 days for training. And the Aurora Town Police Department or the Amherst Town Police Department, they don't have the money to send all their officers off for a 4 or 5 day course. The state has to fund that, because if the state does not fund that, then our law enforcement officers who pull someone over are not going to be able to recognize if someone's high on marijuana. And we need that changed. So I'll finish up right here that, you know, in answer to the webinar's question, now what? Well, Here's what's now what. We got to make sure our roadways and highways are safe. That's the bottom line, and that's now what. Tony, thanks a lot, and I'll kick it back to you, John.
Thank you, DA Flynn. Those are great comments. We appreciate that. I hope you're going to stick around for questions. I just had that question. Okay. So our next speaker is an experienced, dynamic, and committed public health professional, Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds. He is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Family and Children's Association, based in Garden City, New York. Since it began as an orphanage more than 134 years ago, Family and Children's Association has been committed to caring for Long Island's children, youth, seniors, and families. The organization offers community-based programs for struggling families, at-risk adolescents, seniors, and individuals with substance abuse disorders. Today, the association is one of Long Island's largest health and human service organizations with an annual budget of $20 million, 340 staff, and 30+ programs. Dr. Reynolds also serves as the executive director of the Long Island Council on Drug Dependence. Under Dr. Reynolds' leadership, the council has pioneered the launch of Too Good for Drugs, an evidence-based program for K-12 in Long Island schools. Dr. Reynolds also currently serves on Governor Cuomo's Heroin and Opioid Task Force, the executive committee of the Nassau County Heroin Prevention Task Force, and is chair of Suffolk County Sober Home Oversight Board. And this is just a small part of your bio, Doctor. I had to cut it down. It was pretty extensive. He has authored more than 250 news and op-ed articles that have appeared in a wide variety of publications and is consistently used as an expert source for substance abuse and addiction information by local, national radio, television, online, and print outlets. So thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for appearing with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, John, and thanks for having me. Greetings to DA Flynn. I'm lucky to have two great DAs out here in Nassau and Suffolk between Tim Sini and Madeline Singas, and both very forceful on this issue and both very forceful as the law was being passed. It was our position as an organization, and of course there were components of the bill that we actually liked. There were components of the bill that troubled us, and our main point was this bill should not have been passed until law enforcement had the technology necessary to detect impaired drivers. We currently lack that technology, and our sense was we should not have moved forward with legislation until such time as that became a reality. Having said that, that's above all of our pay grades, and the legislature decided to do what they did. I will say, in coming from Nassau and Suffolk County, and we serve folks island-wide here, the issues that we face in suburban communities are very different than what we'd see in urban communities. And largely it was urban-based legislators who advanced this agenda, although most of our folks from Long Island actually voted for the bills. But when you line up counties in terms of roadway fatalities, Suffolk remains at the top of the list and has been for a very long time, and Nassau isn't far behind. And a recent study from Newsday came out and said that we all spend an exorbitant amount of time every day traveling Long Island's roadways, which means that our residents have more to win, or as the case may be, lose in this scenario. I will say that when we look at other states, and I visited Colorado, I was on the governor's recreational marijuana task force 2 years ago when the law was not passed. But I spent some time in Denver visiting the dispensaries, visiting grow houses, and talking to mental health providers in that community. And I will tell you that the data related to car crashes is somewhat hard to pin down. It's hard to pin down because, as you heard in the intro, the number of folks testing positive for THC has increased in a pretty significant way, particularly for fatal car crashes, but we don't necessarily know if that person was impaired at the time. We know that THC can remain in your system for several weeks, even maybe a month. And so we don't have a good sense as to whether or not fatal car crashes or non-fatals have increased in states that have moved forward. I will say intuitively, in the sense of folks on the ground, is that the answer is yes, that this did not reduce impaired driving, that this did not reduce car crashes, and that there has been an impact. It's just really, really hard to pinpoint what it is. We also know that there's a huge amount of data out there that suggests that people think it's okay to drive after consuming marijuana. And I will tell you that Pre-pandemic, I spent a lot of time in classrooms talking with high school students. I spent a lot of time at parent universities talking with parents about how to address substance use disorders among their kids. And every time I raise the question with kids, how many of you think it's okay to drive while high? How many of you do drive while high? Almost every hand in those auditoriums went up. And there were young people who said, I actually think I drive better after I smoke a joint. And in exploring some of that, I would say, so how come you think that? Where does that come from? Well, I'm more chill, I'm a little less aggressive, it just helps me focus a little bit better. And we kind of all know kind of that the answer to that is that's simply not the case. But generally, if you look at all the national data, there is a storyline out there among folks that says it's fine to drive high. And quite frankly, here on Long Island, and I don't know if it's the same in other areas of the state, but it's frequent now that you're driving along the roadway and smell marijuana coming out of other cars. And it's leaking into your car. And that didn't happen a year ago. It didn't happen 2 years ago. And my prediction is that that will increase over time. There's a lot of debate about impairment associated with marijuana versus impairment associated with alcohol. And although we all agree that it's probably different, nobody's sure what that means. Does that mean that alcohol is more deadly than marijuana? We don't necessarily know. It's our position, I imagine it's AAA's position, that anything that diminishes your ability to operate a motor vehicle, whether that's alcohol, oxycodone, Xanax, or a cell phone, is not a good thing and makes our roadways a little less safe. But if you look at a lot of the controlled studies that have been done in driving simulation machines that have been done on closed roadways, we know that marijuana impairment does limit your ability to operate a motor vehicle. And if you think about this intuitively, operating a motor vehicle is the single most complex thing we do all day, particularly if you travel the Long Island Expressway like I do on a regular basis. And so all of your senses need to be firing on all cylinders in order to maximize your safety quotient. If you're using marijuana, you simply don't have the ability to do that. One thing that we do know for sure, and somebody mentioned this, is that when we talk about alcohol and marijuana, those two in combination have an exponential and synergizing effect in which 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, 1 + 1 = 7. And one of the things that we pushed very hard for among the legislators in passing the bill was this whole notion of on-site consumption in conjunction with alcohol. And quite frankly, we think that's a really dangerous proposition. When you begin to mix the two, it has public health consequences, particular to road safety, but beyond that, that far exceed using one of those substances in and of itself. I will say these discussions around alcohol versus marijuana are somewhat unsettling, and they're a little bit hard to answer. We know that generally alcohol continues to kill more people than every other substance under the sun. I've been front and center, as you heard from my bio, on opioid and heroin addiction, and clearly that epidemic has hit New York State in a way that it hasn't hit other states. Yet we still know that alcohol kills more people than heroin. The issue is it just takes a little bit longer, and alcohol cirrhosis looks a little bit different than a fatal overdose of a kid in a parent's bathroom. We also know that as we think about consumer education, it's our position, and again, I imagine our position mirrors the DA's position as well as AAA, and that consuming no amount of alcohol prior to operating a motor vehicle is a safe proposition. Yet we know that there are some folks online who have put out guidelines, and we have 50 years worth of data that suggests that 0.08 is that magic number in terms of legal versus illegal, which is different from safe versus unsafe. But we know that 0.08 is that number, and since 1959, law enforcement has had a breathalyzer to test someone's blood alcohol concentration. We don't have the same when it comes to marijuana, and marijuana is not a singular drug, quite frankly. And so whether you smoke or use edibles, it's a very different proposition. In terms of THC content, we know that there are huge swings and huge variations. The legislature, I think, did not do a great job of capping out THC levels, which I think they should have done. Although to their credit, they did base the taxation rates on THC levels, which makes intuitive sense. If we believe that THC contributes to public health downsides, including car crashes, then it should be taxed at a higher rate in order to remediate some of that damage associated with it, and quite frankly, to discourage the consumption of high THC products. But I've had a number of folks who have said to me, how long should I wait after smoking before I drive a car? I don't have any good answers, right? We can all say you shouldn't smoke marijuana or use edibles or consume cannabis in any way and then operate a motor vehicle. We know that cannabis use has increased in a pretty significant way in states that have legalized. It tends to settle back down over time, and that you have folks that, you know, are into their 40s and 50s who smoked weed when they were in high school. It's legalized, they take a trip out to the local dispensary, use it once or twice and realize they're just as paranoid as they were 30 years ago, and they don't continue to use it. It wasn't the trip they hoped for, it was fun, it was a novelty. They don't become heavy and chronic users. So we know that over time, marijuana use increases, but then it settles back down. We do know generally, and I'm not one of these that believes the sky is gonna fall when you legalize marijuana, but I think there are some downsides. And one of the things we do know is that young people use at a higher rate when it's legal because they equate legal with being safe. We also know that heavy and chronic users will use more frequently than they otherwise would in an era of legalization. But we don't have good feedback to give them about how long to wait. And so we have that feedback, and it's done informally online, again, counter to some of our other public health messages, where you know that basically consuming 2 drinks over the course of 60 to 90 minutes while at dinner potentially puts you under that point of weight level, depending upon a whole bunch of things, which is why we hedge a little bit when we educate folks about it. But we can't even approximate that when it comes to marijuana. So I think there are folks who want to be responsible, want to do the right thing, can't judge for themselves when they're impaired, and God knows people can't do that with alcohol either. They don't have a good sense. They don't have handheld breathalyzers they could buy. They have no tools to know how long they should wait or whether or not they should drive that car. And so a big piece of this is the consumer education segment. That's what was missing. The DA highlighted a number of things that were missing in all of this. There were some of us who said, the legislature simply having this conversation over the course of the past 3 or 4 years has lessened the perceived risk among young people and families who somehow believe if it's almost legal, it must be safer than we originally thought. And I think when it comes to drug education, we are providing more nuanced messages, but if anything, the THC content is higher. And so we had said at the outset, you know, you're counting the dollars before they actually appear in the way of revenues, but nobody's talking about some of the monies that should be spent up front. They did set aside $35 million to stand up the Office of Cannabis Management. And so out of the gate, this is a losing proposition financially. But we had recommended that they take at least $5 million and put it into a widespread public education campaign now, instead of waiting for 2 years when the revenues finally start coming in and then trying to chase this once the horse is out of the gate, or whatever the metaphor is. They should get in front of this now and say legal doesn't necessarily mean safe. And aside from the driving issue, which I think is really, really important, and that's what we're here to talk about today, there are other issues. There are issues around access to minors and limiting access to those young people. I will tell you my recommendation to the state was that the age should not have been 21, it should have been 25, given what we now know about brain development in young people. And as some women in my life will attest, sometimes your brain isn't fully developed until you're well into your 50s if you're a male. And so raising that age to 25 should have been part and parcel to all of this. Second concern, obviously, are folks that have mental health disorders. We know that now post-COVID, folks are suffering from depression and anxiety in levels that we have never, ever, ever seen before. There's a number of folks who will turn to licensed healthcare practitioners or online telehealth platforms to deal with those feelings, particularly as it relates to young people. There's a fair number of folks that will say, weed makes my anxiety go away. It helps me. We worry about folks who go undiagnosed and instead turn to marijuana to medicate those feelings away and what happens to them over the course of the long term. The other population that we're of course concerned about are pregnant women. And we haven't yet addressed that. And I'll tell you that I stood in marijuana dispensaries in Denver and listened to folks who worked in those stores give out stuff that sounded an awful lot like medical advice. And I heard a pregnant woman come in, disclose morning sickness, disclose that she was in the 2nd trimester. they actually recommended she use marijuana to stave off that morning sickness. That's a public health disaster, and that's an abuse that is one of the potential downsides in all of this. And in fact, in the state of Colorado, they sent out investigators to actually ask some of those questions. And they found in 70% of the time when they sent in testers, the bud tender, as they call them, actually recommended marijuana as a way of addressing morning sickness. And so there's a lot that we need to be worried about here. The last thing I'll mention, and I know we want to save time for questions and answers, that hasn't been addressed, and certainly, you know, it has to do with impairment, but there's another issue here, and that for years we watched families, you know, smoke in vehicles with kids locked in them. And as I think about marijuana now and the two kids sitting in the back seat as somebody smokes marijuana as they drive a vehicle, the issue of secondhand smoke is something that we should really be focused on. And the bigger theme there is, when it comes to tobacco, we let a huge industry have its way with our kids and have its way with public health for several decades. And then finally we got smart, and attorneys like DA Flynn decided that they could go after the tobacco companies and not only limit them, but make them pay for the damage they had caused in the community. I worry that the same thing is happening now, and that we didn't learn the lessons around tobacco use, particularly as it relates to minors. We had finally begun to turn the corner when it comes to opioids, and yet we've now legalized yet another intoxicating substance. And again, attorneys have gone after the opioid manufacturers and distributors, and New York is about to get a huge lump sum of money to remediate the damage that those folks caused. When we think about the legalization of marijuana, I worry that we give back the gains that we've made around impaired driving. You know, here in Nassau and Suffolk County, there have been a number of high-profile cases. We have very aggressive prosecutors. We have very, very good educational programs under the Stop DWI programs. And we've actually seen a drop in roadway fatalities related to alcohol, and that comes from prevention and law enforcement. I worry that we give those gains back along the way. I think most importantly, it's important to understand that what New York State has done, there's a continuum here, and the continuum includes decriminalization. That means that we're not going to lock up people for holding a dime bag anymore and put them away and destroy families and futures and everything else. And then there's legalization, which to me means things like home grow and not doing stop and frisk and things like that. And then at the far end of the spectrum is commercialization. New York has done commercialization. We're calling it legalization, but essentially what New York has done is they have said to marijuana entrepreneurs, come on in. You can set up stores, assuming the counties and municipalities agree to that. You can sell a whole lot of marijuana. Yeah, folks can grow it in their homes, but we're going to allow you to set up shop in our state. And if you look at the JCOPE website and you look at who is pushing for marijuana reform, you know, yes, there were the normals of the world, and that is folks that just want to be left alone and believe that marijuana is a plant and that it's no less dangerous than some other substances out there. No more dangerous than some other substances out there. But you also had a whole bunch of white shoe law firms and lobbyists that had flooded the halls of Albany that were pushing very, very hard for this to happen. They've gotten their way. I think our focus now as communities, as law enforcement leaders, as health and human service professionals, needs to be to protect our communities from that, to ensure that this is happening. How do we do it in a way that's less disruptive? How do we do this in a way that preserves safety? And ultimately, you know, my worry, and I'm sure it's the worry of the DA too, is that you're going to begin seeing headlines where impaired drivers, impaired only on marijuana, are taking out kids in crossings, or taking out kids in other vehicles, and that we're going to begin to see the ramifications of this. I do think waiting for the technology is really important, but almost most importantly, as someone who spent my entire life promoting prevention, we can do a lot to prevent these fatalities. And a lot of that relates to education, and a lot of that relates to having these conversations now before marijuana use becomes even more widespread and we have stores set up all over New York State. So I will stop at that. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate the work of AAA. I certainly appreciate the work of DA Flynn. And so thank you. I look forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Reynolds. So yeah, I do have a number of questions here. Will there be a objective measurement like a BAC test for alcohol to be used in court to charge someone? Maybe they're referring to the roadside oral fluid testing. I think there was a provision in the legislation to authorize the Department of Health to study this. Would one of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, as of right now, there is no instrument to use in court. As of right now, unlike alcohol, there is no handy dandy a tube to blow in back at the station house or even roadside. So when it comes to proving the case in court, like I said before, I either need an admission by the individual. I need to have some kind of physical evidence that marijuana was used, either the smell of marijuana, marijuana in the car itself, or a blood test. What I didn't mention before is that you can detect THC in marijuana in a blood test. Obviously, though, the rules and regulations on obtaining a blood test vary depending on the facts of the case. And so it's in here. There are a lot of smart people out there. We got a COVID vaccine in like 8 months. All right. So I don't doubt that someday someone's gonna come up with a machine that's gonna be able to test marijuana. It hasn't been done yet, but again, I believe in science, and I believe in how smart doctors are and scientists are and chemists are. And someday they're going to have that, but as of right now, we do not have that.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Mr. Flynn, if you refuse a roadside assessment from a DRE, does that result in any kind of automatic sanction? For example, if you now refuse a breathalyzer?
No. So again, you have to have some type of recognition that the driver is impaired. Okay, and so if you refuse to do any roadside assistant test with alcohol, you don't have your license suspended because you refuse to do it, the finger to nose test. Okay, you can refuse that right now. Even for alcohol, if you get pulled over, you don't have to take the test. Okay, the roadside test. It's your refusal to take the breathalyzer test that gets you in trouble with the DMV and gets you in legal trouble. All right. There is no breathalyzer test for marijuana, so the equivalent is not there. And so long answer to your question is no. You can refuse.
A question for Dr. Reynolds with respect to edibles. You mentioned that many of the edibles have a higher level of THC. What's your sense of the public knowledge of this and education? From what I've read, if you take an edible, it's often can take a couple hours to kind of kick in, as opposed to other forms.
Yeah, so that's, body absorption is always a little bit different. And, we've all heard the stories of the well-meaning folks that try this out and then wind up in an emergency room. And generally what happens is, to your point, there's a delay in terms of the actual impact. And so if the person has a THC-laced brownie, they consume some, feel absolutely nothing, say, I guess I need to use more. And then use more, and then that hits both barrels. That's one of the places where we've seen a pretty significant increase in emergency department visits and calls to poison control centers. There too, I worry about people driving. And so if you're at a party or at a gathering and you use edibles, and you think I'm okay, and then an hour later you're less than okay, and those tend to be pretty significant reactions. They're not the same as smoking. They tend to be outsized reactions. If you are not an experienced marijuana user and you use edibles, knowingly use edibles, you're likely to be surprised in terms of how that hits you. And if you're not experienced, then your body hasn't built up the same tolerance. Even if you are an experienced user and you've used smoked flower cannabis on a regular basis, the use of edibles is dramatically different. I also worry a little bit about some of the packaging, and some of the issues that have happened in other states is that some of these products are packaged to look in a very fun kind of way, not designed to appeal to 50-year-old guys like me, but they're in neon packages, they're shaped like gummy bears. I actually saw lots of sodas that were THC infused in Denver, and those kinds of things worry me a little bit because it enhances the unpredictability and also increases the possibility that someone's going to consume THC and not fully understand that they've consumed THC.
Yeah, actually, I did have a question on that as well. The packaging, I remember as a little kid, they used to package the candy cigarettes in the 5 and dime stores.
Yeah.
Would there be any state regulation of that, do you think?
Yeah, there are some broad parameters that are built out in the bill. A lot of this, the devil is going to be in the details, and there's a whole series of regulations that need to be promulgated by the Office of Cannabis Management going forward. Those are going to be forthcoming. There were some of us who openly advocated that there ought to be a pretty large skull and crossbones, and I'm not kidding, on all of the packaging, similar to what we do with tobacco at this point in time. Again, case in point, not related to driving, but in Denver, there was actually a doubling of emergency room visits among toddlers because mom and dad would begin using edibles. Mom and dad would experience everything that comes along with using an edible. They'd leave the unfinished remains on a table or out. A toddler would walk by and ingest them. And obviously, high potency THC in a toddler's body plays out even more differently than it would in an adult's body. And so, a lot of us have begun promoting the fact that they ought to be sold in packaging that is not child accessible, that it ought to be akin to what you would see in child-proof caps. That we ought to begin talking with parents about safe storage of cannabis products, similar to the way you would lock up your opioids and those kinds of things. And that there really needs to be some curbs on this industry in terms of how they package and how they market and how these things look. The good thing is there's a number of companies in Colorado that are actually producing child-proof containers for transporting and storing cannabis products, which I think is actually a good thing, and it's actually pretty responsible on their part.
Okay, thank you. I got a lot of questions rolling in here. One question, could the legal age be changed from 21 to 25, which I guess is maybe part of a larger question. Do you think there'll be some kind of legislative cleanup bill, so to speak, possibly next year to revisit some of these issues?
I don't have a crystal ball on that, but I pushed hard that the age should be 25, and I gained no traction. And the argument is, look, you draft people into war, they could drink, they could smoke, they could do everything else. Why would this be an outlier when in fact we know that marijuana potentially is less damaging than alcohol might be? So I think there will be a cleanup bill around some issues. I just don't think that makes it in there.
Mr. Flynn, I have a question with respect to the federal offense. Marijuana is legalized in New York. Is it still a federal offense? And does that create a challenge for police agencies?
Yes and yes. It is still a federal offense. It is still. I mentioned in my talk about how New York State under the public health law had a list of controlled substances that marijuana has now been taken off of. The federal system has the same thing. The federal system, they call them schedules. They have a schedules, a list. They have a list of controlled substances that are illegal under federal law, and marijuana is on that list. That becomes a significant problem for law enforcement, especially here in New York, because we are on the Canadian border, and Canada has legalized marijuana. And so when you have a nation that legalizes marijuana, now we are seeing more and more here in Buffalo. The number of trucks that are coming over the border here that we're catching filled with marijuana. Again, I don't know how it is in the North Country in New York. I assume that's probably just as bad. But yeah, we are wrestling with the problem of marijuana coming into New York from Canada. Now, again, now that it's legalized here, that may that may lessen now. But again, picking up on one of the doctor's points that he made about taxation, one of the concerns that we have as law enforcement officials is that if the taxation is too high, all right, which, who knows how it's going to play out, okay? If the taxation becomes too high, though, then that's going to drive people to the illegal market or back to the illegal market, all right? And so, the illegal market that has been commonplace for the past 50 years, just so you know, that hasn't gone away in Colorado. That hasn't gone away in California or Oregon or Vermont, all right? That's not going to go away in New York. The illegal market are still going to be here. And again, the taxation component of this is going to dictate a lot about how strong that illegal market is.
Yeah, and I would just echo that, in that, in some of the discussions around taxation rates, I think that's the key concern, right? So the public health side of me says, tax it as high as you can to dissuade use. We know that there are people who continue to use products no matter where you price them. And, the beauty, if there is one, of the regulated market is a different type of product that can be tracked from seed to sale. And we know that, cannabis purchased on the street tends to contain mold and spores, and sometimes puts people into situations that can be dangerous for them. So agree 100% on the point.
I have another question here on enforcement. Do you think we'll see more patrols on the roads overall in New York State?
Well, I think you're going to see more patrols on the road just because of coming out of COVID, quite frankly. I mean, coming out of COVID, you're going to see more patrols on the road. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be related to marijuana legislation, because again, going back to my point earlier, is that, I'm not sure how it is in Suffolk or Nassau County, but again, they're a little different because, Suffolk and Nassau County, they have more of a centralized police agency there, okay? We don't have that here in Buffalo. Again, I recognize in Suffolk and Nassau County that there are, 50 to 100 towns and villages in each county, okay? In Buffalo, we have the same thing, here in Erie County. We have over 40 towns and villages here in Erie County. But again, unlike Suffolk and Nassau County, while we do have an Erie County Sheriff's Department, we also have pretty much every single town has their own police department here in Erie County, and which is a little different than across the state. And so, every single town that has that police department is going to need drug recognition experts. So again, it doesn't do us any good if we increase patrols on the road if the officer behind the wheel on patrol can't recognize whether you're high or not. It's counterintuitive. So again, I'm not so sure you're going to see more patrols based upon the marijuana legislation. I think you're going to see more patrols coming out of COVID, though, for sure.
I mean, the other law enforcement concern really is property crime proximate to dispensaries, and there too the data is somewhat mixed. Neither in Colorado nor Washington state have there been significant increases in violent crime, but there have been significant increases in property crimes. In some cases, as much as 1,400% worth of increases. And keep in mind that as long as this remains illegal federally, which could change, it means that the banking associated with cannabis businesses is actually pretty tricky, because banks that are FDIC insured can't do business with cannabis companies. There are some discussions around Bitcoin, Ethereum, credit unions, other folks entering the space. But for a lot of these stores, it's easy to imagine that there'll be a fair amount of cash on site, which in some ways could be a magnet for crime the same way a bank might be a magnet for crime. That's, I think, one of the reasons why, at least out here on Long Island, there are very sharp and vigorous conversations happening right now about where dispensaries are located, what their proximity to residential areas look like, what their proximities to schools and playgrounds and churches and other community centers look like. And as we try to redevelop our downtowns, there are some open questions about, so where does the cannabis industry fit into the revitalization of some of Long Island's downtowns? And you get very, very differing opinions on this. I think the main message for folks that maybe have logged on to this is to get involved in your own community, there's a number of people who think marijuana legalization is not a big deal. It's fine. It's okay. That tends to change though when you say, so would you mind having a pot store in your neighborhood? And especially out here on Long Island, it's not in my backyard. I don't care if they want to do it somewhere else. But those are really important conversations that have to do with quality of life.
Okay, I got quite a few more questions here, but I know we're getting short of time. This one's a little off base with, I'm not sure who could answer this. Maybe you could, Dr. Reynolds. How would legalization impact employers? How can employers ensure that workers are not high or driving to work while impaired?
Boy, that we could do an entire webinar on that. And I will say,
Right.
you know, as an employer myself of 340 people that receives federal money, which means that we have to have a drug-free workplace, it poses some challenges. It also, the law really goes into, you can't discriminate against people related to off-premise marijuana use. And so, you know, if you wind up with staff coming in that smell like marijuana, you potentially have a problem. And the odor is a little bit stronger than it would be with somebody with alcohol. So to say, well, same thing, same way you deal with alcohol, it actually is a little bit different. And given the increase in use, we think it will be different. It's worthwhile noting that here in New York State, a lot of the building trades and union organizations and construction organizations, trade agencies came out in opposition and said they're very, very concerned about workplace safety. And if we think about some of the jobs that people do, smoking marijuana on your lunch hour is not a great idea, particularly when we talk about construction and when we talk about highway workers and that kind of thing, folks who operate heavy machinery. It's probably not great for anybody. But there so far is no perfect solution to this. I will say it's going to pose significant challenges for the workforce.
Okay. Tony, would you like to make any closing comments here?
Well, thanks, John. First off, great thank yous. I'll go out to John Flynn and Dr. Reynolds. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I know John's got a number of other questions, and maybe we can come back at another time and get to a lot of these. We're just on the precipice of this thing going on, and you know the issue that we all are concerned with are the kids. You know, and what is it that the kids are doing? What is it that the kids are going to be doing going forward? And I think there's more to write in these chapters. But once again, thank you, John, for hosting this, and thank you, DA Flynn, and thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for just giving us some great information. I know that there's more to come in regards to this. Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I'd just like to thank Shawnee Jarvis, Mark Shieldrop, and Alex Lackey and RN for helping to produce this. And I guess that's it. Take care, everybody. Thank you again, and be well and be safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.